What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to Guys at Magic. I'm your host, Dave, and today we're going to be going through a deck tech of Ghalta Stampede Tyrant. This is one of the new legendary creatures from the Lost Caverns of Ixalan. If you are interested in this deck, this is going to be a mono-green stompy-focused build that's just going to be utilizing our commander to cheat other big creatures into play. Super excited to talk about this one. I think that Ghalta actually has a lot of power to it. Before we continue on with the video, though, please make sure that you like and subscribe to this channel, follow us on our other social media platforms, and if you really want to be able to add that extra layer of support, we have recently started a Patreon, which the link for that is going to be down below in the description. Without further ado, though, Ghalta is 5 and 3 green for a total of 8 mana. It is a legendary creature, Elder Dinosaur. It's a 12/12 with trample, and it says whenever it enters the battlefield, put any number of creature cards from your hand onto the battlefield. So this is a super important ability for this deck. It allows us to cheat our creatures into play. And another really big thing to point out here is that we actually don't have to cast Ghalta in order to take advantage of that trigger. It's an enter the battlefield effect, and there's a couple of ways for us to be able to exploit that in this list too. The other big thing just to kind of notice, if you haven't already, is that this is a 12/12 with trample. If this connects twice, you're going to be able to kill your opponents with commander damage, and due to that trample, well, there's a pretty significant chance that you'll be able to push at least some damage through. With this list, we're going to be focused primarily just around big mono-green stompy, so we're going to have a lot of mana, we're going to have a lot of mana production, and we're going to try our absolute best to take advantage of the fact that our creatures are massive. The first two cards that I want to talk about in this list are both Planeswalkers, the first of which is Garruk Primal Hunter. This is 2 and 3 green for a total of 5 mana. It enters the battlefield with 3 starting loyalty and has 3 abilities. The first of which is a +1 that says create a 3/3 green beast creature token, and that's cool and all, but doesn't really do a whole lot for the deck. The -3, however, is really where the power comes in for this card. It says draw cards equal to the greatest power among creatures you control. If we have our commander in play, that's draw 12 cards for a single -3 on Garruk, and assuming that we plussed him once before, we could potentially repeat that effect. That is a massive amount of card draw. If you do want to get to it, or have the opportunity to at least, it does also have an ultimate at -6 that says create a 6/6 green worm creature token for each land you control. That's a lot of power that you're going to be able to pump into play. Garruk is a card that even if you do just slam it down at -3 immediately, you're going to generate a ton of value off this, and if it does manage to actually stick around in ult, you'll probably just win the game on the back of this card. Next up here, we have Nissa, who shakes the world. This is 3 and 2 green for a legendary Planeswalker, Nissa. She enters with 5 starting loyalty and has an ability that says whenever you tap a forest for mana, add an additional green. This is going to be really nice with this deck because since we are going to be playing mono green, we have a ton of forests, which means that all of those lands are going to be able to tap for 2 mana instead of just 1. She's also got a couple of abilities on her as well, the first of which is a +1 that says put 3 +1/+1 counters on up to 1 target non-creature land you control. Untap it, it becomes a 0/0 elemental creature with vigilance and haste that is still a land. So it provides you with just an extra creature that you can start to swing in with. Also, it kind of pseudo ramps you in that it does untap the land. So if you did tap it previously for 2 green mana, you can plus this, untap it, and then tap it again for an additional 2 green mana. She also has an ultimate which comes in at a -8. It says you get an emblem with lands you control have indestructible. Search your library for any number of forest cards, put them onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library. Although that's probably not going to win you a game, it will most certainly ramp you up to a point where you're not going to have to care about mana ever again. Moving over, we're going to dive into our creature package. The first group of creatures that I want to talk about are primarily going to be included in here more so as a supporting role. So these aren't necessarily going to be the big creatures that we're going to be beating down with, but they're very important in this list nonetheless. The first card here is Allosaurus Shepherd. This is a single green mana for a creature elf shaman. It is a 1/1, and it says that it can't be countered. It also says that green spells you control can't be countered, and it has an ability where you may pay 4 and 2 green, and it says until end of turn, each elf creature you control has base power and toughness 5/5 and become a dinosaur in addition to its other creature types. Allosaurus Shepherd allows us to have our creatures become uncounterable, which prevents our opponents from being able to interact with us in that regard. The other thing here being is there's actually a fairly decent number of elves in this list, as we're going to come across here in just a moment. So that 6 mana ability can actually still be pretty relevant. The next creature here is Temur Sabertooth. This is 2 and 2 green for a total of 4 mana. It is a creature cat, and it is a 4/3. It has an ability in which you may pay 1 and a green, and and you may return another creature you control to its owner's hand. If you do, Temur Sabertooth gains indestructible until end of turn. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with this card, this allows us to bounce a creature back to our hand, allowing us to potentially recast it and take advantage of an ETB a second time around. This is super important in this list because that means that even if our commander is in play and not necessarily dying, we can still take advantage of its abilities by bouncing it back to our hand and then casting it again. And once again, just for those of you who are not aware of it, casting a commander from your hand does not increase its mana cost due to commander tax. That's only applied whenever you cast it from the command zone. So Temur Sabertooth is kind of a fun little way for us to get around that. Up next, we have Prowling Serpapod. This is 1 and 2 green for a creature cat snake. It is a 4/3 that says it can't be countered. It also says creature spells you control can't be countered. So along the same lines as Allosaurus Shepherd, it's just going to be an additional piece that's going to help us out. Also, this one comes in as a 4/3, which isn't necessarily the biggest creature, but 4 power is still fairly relevant and can put in some work. Up next, we have Nylea Keen-Eyed. This is 3 and a green for a legendary enchantment creature god. It is a 5/6 with indestructible and says as long as your devotion to green is less than 5, she isn't a creature. She also says the creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast, and she's got an ability in which you may pay 2 and a green to reveal the top card of your library. If it is a creature card, put it into your hand, otherwise you may put it into your graveyard. So that's just going to be a nice little mana sink, especially in the mid to late game, allowing us to make sure that we're constantly drawing into more gas and potentially just overwhelming our opponents with creatures. Lastly, in this package, we have Goreclaw, Terror of Calcisma. This is 3 and a green for a legendary creature bear. It is a 4/3 and says creature spells you cast with power 4 or greater cost 2 mana less to cast. It also says whenever it attacks, each creature you control with power 4 or greater gets +1/+1 and gains trample until end of turn. This allows us to have our creatures push for that damage with that trample effect, while also adding a nice little mana reduction. The next group of creatures that I'm going to talk about all are focused on making sure that our hand is stacked. We want to make sure that we have the ability to cast Ghalta and drop as many creatures as possible, and this group is going to help us to make sure we have something worthwhile. The first card here is Battle Mammoth. This is 3 and 2 green for a creature elephant. It is a 6/5 with trample and says, whenever a permanent you control becomes the target of a spell or an ability an opponent controls, you may draw a card. It also has a Foretell ability for 2 and 2 green. Toski, Bearer of Secrets is 3 and a green for a legendary creature squirrel. It is a 1/1 that cannot be countered. It has indestructible. It attacks each combat if able, and it says whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. This will trigger on multiple instances of combat damage as well, so Toski is great at refilling your hand. Soul of the Harvest is 4 and 2 green for a creature elemental. It is a 6/6 with trample and says whenever another non-token creature you control enters the battlefield under your control, you may draw a card. So a nice little way for us to make sure that we are refilling our hand. Another super important thing here being is that it doesn't actually say cast, it just cares about it entering the battlefield. So even if we do cheat things into play with Ghalta, Soul of the Harvest will still have us draw cards off of them. Regal Force is 4 and 3 green for a total of 7 mana. It is a creature elemental that is a 5/5. It says whenever it enters the battlefield, draw a card for each green creature you control. And then of course we also have Beast Whisperer in this as well. This is 2 and 2 green for a creature elf druid. It is a 2/3 and says whenever you cast a creature spell, draw a card. This next group of creatures is all going to be focused about helping to make sure that we are ramping and getting enough mana to cast our commander. The first card here is going to be Circle of Dreams Druid. This is 3 green for a creature elf druid. It is a 2/1 that you can tap to add a green mana to your mana pool for each creature you control. Delighted Halfling is a single green mana for a creature halfling citizen. It is a 1/2 that you can tap to add a colorless, or you can tap it and add 1 mana of any color, spend this mana only to cast legendary spells, and that spell cannot be countered. Elvish Mystic is a single green mana for a creature elf druid. That is a 1/1 that you can tap for a green. Findhorn Elves is also a single green mana for an elf druid, 1/1 that you can tap for a green. Llanowar Elves is 1 green mana for a 1/1 elf druid that can tap for a green. And Birds of Paradise is a single green mana for a creature bird. It is a 0/1 with flying, and you can tap to add 1 mana of any color. We also have Selvala, Heart of the Wilds. She is 1 and 2 green for a 2/3 legendary creature elf scout. She has an ability that states whenever another creature enters the battlefield, its controller may draw a card if its power is greater than each other creature's power. She also has an ability in which you may pay a green and tap her to add X mana in any combination of colors, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. Selvala is an excellent mana dork. She has the ability to generate massive amounts of mana, and in a deck like this, she can be absolutely insane. We also have Gwenna, Eyes of Gaia, and this is 2 and a green for a legendary creature Elf Druid Scout. It is a 2/3 that you may tap to add 2 mana in any combination of colors. Spend this mana only to cast creature spells or activate abilities of creatures. It also says that whenever you cast a creature spell with power 5 or greater, you put a +1/+1 counter on Gwenna and then untap it. So you have the potential to use her ability multiple times over the course of a turn. Dryad of the Elysian Grove is 2 and a green for an enchantment creature Nymph. It is a 2/4 that says you may play an additional land on each of your turns, and it says lands you control are every basic land type in addition to their other types. And then lastly in this package, we have Sakura Tribe Elder. This is 1 and a green for a creature Snake Shaman. It is a 1/1 that you may sacrifice, search your library for a basic land card, put that card onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library. A couple of our creatures could be included in this list simply for the sake of them being able to interact with our opponents, the first of which is Collector Oof. This is 1 and a green for a total of 2 mana. It is a creature Oof. It is a 2/2 and says activated abilities of artifacts cannot be activated. Now, super important, this does shut down your artifacts as well, but we actually aren't going to be running a whole lot in this list. Most of our mana production comes from our creatures or some of our other ramp spells that we'll come across later on. So we don't actually have a ton of artifacts, and if we shut down all of them, there's a really good chance we're hurting our opponents a lot more than what we're hurting ourselves. Thrashing Brontodon is 1 and 2 green for a creature dinosaur. It is a 3/4. You may pay 1 mana and sacrifice it to destroy target artifact or enchantment. And Reclamation Sage does something very similar in that it is 2 and a green for a total of 3 mana. It is a 2/1 creature Elf Shaman and says whenever it enters the battlefield, you may destroy target artifact or enchantment. Lastly, in this category, to help us shut off graveyard strategies, we have Scavenging Ooze. This is 1 and a green for a creature Ooze. It is a 2/2 that you may pay a green mana and exile target card from a graveyard. If it was a creature card, you'll put a +1/+1 counter on Scavenging Ooze and you'll gain 1 life. Now for the moment that you have all been waiting for, let's talk about some of the big creatures that are really going to help us to just kind of put our deck over the edge and annihilate our opponents. The first one here is Gigantosaurus. This is 5 green mana for a 10/10 dinosaur. It doesn't have any other abilities on it, however, I love the fact that this is just very straightforward and it's relatively easy to cast, even in the case that we don't have our commander. Next up, we have Zoprindel, Hunger Dominus. This is 5 and 2 green for a legendary creature, Phyrexian Horror. It is a 4/6 with reach. It also says that at the beginning of each combat, double the power and toughness of each creature you control until end of turn. You may pay 2 Phyrexian green to sacrifice 2 other creatures, put an indestructible counter on this card. Really, the reason why this is going to be included in the deck is because this makes our creatures absolutely massive, and with our commander starting off being a 12/12 with trample, that means it's going to be a 24/24 with trample. So long as this card is also in play, there's a really good chance that that just kills somebody. We couldn't play a big mono green Stompy deck without including this next one, and that's going to be the original biggest creature, I guess in any legal set, or in any like standard legal set, that would be. And that would be a Worldspine Worm. This is 8 and 3 green for a total of 11 mana. It is a creature worm. It is a 15/15 with trample and says that whenever it dies, put 3 5/5 green worm creature tokens with trample onto the battlefield. It also says that whenever it's put into a graveyard from anywhere, shuffle it into its owner's library. That's going to be really important as we're going to be drawing an absolute massive number of cards with this deck, so this might be a card that helps to save us from decking ourselves. Up next here, we have Tyrannix Rex. This is 4 and 3 green for a total of 7 mana. It is a creature Phyrexian dinosaur. It is an 8/8, and it says it cannot be countered. It has Trample, Toxic 4, Ward 4, and Haste. It's a big body with a lot of abilities. We have Terastodon up next. This is 6 and 2 green for a total of 8 mana. It is a creature elephant. It is a 9/9 and says whenever it enters the battlefield, you may destroy up to 3 target non-creature permanents. For each permanent put into a graveyard this way, its controller creates a 3/3 green elephant creature token. Ultimately, that's not going to matter. Our creatures are way bigger than 3/3s, so I don't care if we're giving them elephants. We're blowing up things that they needed for their board states. We have Verdant Sun's Avatar up next. This is 5 and 2 green for a total of 7 mana. It is a creature dinosaur avatar. It is a 5/5 and says whenever it or another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you gain life equal to that creature's toughness. This is a nice little way to make sure that we are going to be out of the range of any kind of deck that just wants to win via good old combat damage. We should be able to gain a just ludicrous amount of life with Verdant Sun's Avatar. And then, of course, we're playing Big Stompy, so we have to. We've got Eldrazi in the list. The first one here is It That Betrays. It is 12 mana for a creature Eldrazi. It is an 11/11 with Annihilator 2. For those of you who don't remember, Annihilator 2 says that whenever this creature attacks, the defending player sacrifices 2 permanents. It also says whenever an opponent sacrifices a non-token permanent, put that card onto the battlefield under your control. Ulamog's Crusher is 8 mana for an 8/8 creature Eldrazi. It has Annihilator 2 and says that it must attack each combat if able, but let's be real, this thing does so much damage just by attacking, and of course you're going to want to swing with this every single combat. We also have Kozilek, Butcher of Truth. This is 10 mana for a 12/12. It says whenever you cast this spell, draw 4 cards. It has Annihilator 4, and it also says that whenever it is put into a graveyard from anywhere, its owner shuffles their graveyard into their library. Once again, this is a deck that is capable very easily of actually decking itself due to the amount of cards that you can draw. Cards like Kozilek or Worldspine Worm are actually really important in this list so that you don't actually mill yourself to death. And then, of course, we also have Ulamog the Infinite Gyre. This is 11 mana for a 10/10 that says whenever you cast it, destroy target permanent. It has Indestructible. It also has Annihilator 4. And then, of course, it's got that last clause in there that whenever it is put into a graveyard from anywhere, its owner shuffles his or her graveyard into his or her library. The next 2 creature cards that I'm going to talk about are cards that I didn't necessarily fell into any of the above categories, but are just really good creatures to have, especially in a list like this. The first of which being Solemn Simulacrum. This is 4 mana for a 2/2 artifact creature golem. It says whenever it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a basic land card, put that card onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. It also says that whenever it dies, you may draw a card. And then we also have Saruk and Goreclaw in here. This is 4 and 2 green for a legendary creature, Human Bear. It is a 6/5 that has Trample. It says other creatures you control have Trample. And then it says whenever another non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on it. It gains haste until end of turn. So allowing your other creatures to start swinging in as big, hasty tramplers is just really impactful. I mean, this is a card that your opponents are going to need to kill on sight. Otherwise, you're just going to have such an explosive factor to your deck. That's going to do it for our creature package. From here, we're going to move over to some of our instants and sorceries. This first group is all about finding lands. The first card here is Nature's Lore. This is 1 and a green for a sorcery that says search your library for a forest card, put it on the battlefield, and then shuffle your library. We have Rampant Growth, which is 1 and a green for a sorcery. Search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. And then we have 3 Visits, which is 1 and a green for a sorcery, saying search your library for a forest card, put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle. All 3 of these are relatively cheap, allow us to go and find some extra lands, and just provide some solid ramp. We have Crop Rotation in this list. This is a single green mana for an instant. It says as an additional cost to cast Crop Rotation, sacrifice a land. It then says search your library for a land card, put that card onto the battlefield, then shuffle your library. Super important to note about Crop Rotation is that you do not have to go find a basic land. You can just go find whatever land you want, and there is a land that we really do want in this list. We're going to come across that here in just a little bit. The last one of our dedicated ramp instant or sorcery cards is going to be Traverse the Outlands. This is 4 and a green for a sorcery that says search your library for up to X basic land cards, where X is the greatest power amongst creatures you control. Put those cards onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library. With your commander in play, this is 5 mana for a sorcery that says go find 12 forests and put them directly into play. This next group of instants and sorceries are cards that are going to just send us over the top and help us to just win the game. The first one here is Overwhelming Stampede. This is 3 and 2 green for a total of 5 mana. It is a sorcery that says, until end of turn, creatures you control gain trample and get +X until end of turn, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. Remember all of those little utility elves and mana dorks that we had earlier on with our commander in play? They just gained +12, and trample, so they became very, very scary. Rishkar's Expertise is 4 and 2 green for a sorcery that says draw cards equal to the greatest power among creatures you control, and then says you may cast a spell with mana value of 5 or less from your hand without paying its mana cost. Fun fact, you can cast Overwhelming Stampede off of Rishkar's Expertise. Next up, we have Return of the Wild Speaker. If you like the last 2 cards, you're going to love this because it kind of does the same thing as both of them. This is 5 mana for an instant. It says choose one. You may either draw cards equal to the greatest power amongst non-human creatures you control, or non-human creatures you control get +3/+3 until end of turn. It's not quite as big of a bump as maybe Overwhelming Stampede, but this should be enough to potentially overwhelm your opponents and send you over the edge. And if you don't want to cast it for that second mode, you always have the option for the first mode of just cast it and draw a ton of cards. The last one here is going to be Hunter's Insight. This is 2 and a green for an instant that says choose target creature you control. Whenever that creature deals combat damage to a player or planeswalker this turn, draw that many cards. This is going to draw us an absolute ton of cards, and if we are targeting our commander with this, keep in mind, even if they blocked, our commander has trample, so we are bound to get in for some amount of damage. Next up, we're going to move over to our interaction package. Now, sadly, we are going to be in mono green, so interaction is not the best here. This is going to be one of the downsides of the deck, but that's okay. Our main focus is really just going to be to overwhelm our opponents with big things, tons of creatures, and then of course a 12/12 trampler that they have to worry about with commander damage. The first card here is going to be Beast Within. This is 2 and a green for an instant. It says destroy target permanent. Its controller creates a 3/3 green beast creature token. The next card we're going to talk about is Ram Through. This is 1 and a green for an instant. It says target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to target creature you don't control. If the creature you control has trample, excess damage is dealt to that creature's controller instead. This works wonderfully with our commander because our commander does have trample, so it will also punish our opponent. Heroic Intervention is 1 and a green for an instant. It says permanents you control gain hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. This is a nice little way for us to be able to save ourselves from a board wipe or any of our opponent's target spot removal. And Veil of Summer is a single green mana for an instant that says draw a card if an opponent has cast a blue or a black spell this turn. Spells you control can't be countered this turn, and you and permanents you control gain hexproof from blue and from black until end of turn. This is pretty similar to that of Heroic Intervention, and in that it's a nice little way for us to be able to protect our things. Now, sadly, this does not grant indestructible, but being able to provide hexproof to blue and to black should be able to stop most of our opponent's interaction. Next up, we're going to move over to the artifacts. They're going to help out this deck, and there's not actually a whole lot here. The first card we're going to talk about is Arcane Signet. This is 2 mana for an artifact that you can tap to add 1 mana of any color in your commander's color identity. The next card is Soul Ring, which for 1 mana, you get an artifact that can tap for 2 mana. And then lastly, as far as our artifact ramp package goes, we have Thought Vessel. This is 2 mana for an artifact that says you have no maximum hand size, and you could tap it to add a colorless. Thought Vessel is really powerful in this list because we are going to be drawing a ton of cards. Just something to consider, though, is that you may not necessarily always want Thought Vessel, just because if you do happen to have one of the big Eldrazi that can jump into our graveyard to be able to get our graveyard back into our library, you won't be able to discard them if Thought Vessel is in play. So just a little bit of something for you to kind of consider and play around with. Thought Vessel will help you keep onto those cards, but it also may put you on a little bit of a clock just because our deck is really good at drawing cards. The next 2 artifacts I'm going to talk about are both equipment, and both work incredibly well in this list. The first of which is Helm of the Host. This is 4 mana for a legendary artifact equipment. It says at the beginning of combat on your turn, create a token that is a copy of the equipped creature, except the token isn't legendary if the equipped creature is legendary and the token gains haste. We do want to equip this to our commander because, once again, as a reminder, our commander doesn't care about being cast, it cares about entering the battlefield. Helm of the Host will take advantage of that by giving us an additional ETB trigger on the token, and that token also gains haste. So we could potentially just kind of reload our ability to dump a massive number of creatures from our hand directly back into play. Lightning Greaves is 2 mana for an artifact equipment. It says the equipped creature has haste and shroud and an equip cost of 0. This is going to make sure that our commander sticks around for as long as possible, and potentially also coming in there with haste, this is going to help it be able to deal some real damage. Now, super important to note here is that this will give your commander shroud if this is equipped to it, which means some of our cards that want to target a creature to draw a lot of cards, you will not be able to target your commander unless you can move the Greaves first. And then the last artifact in this list is Conjurer's Closet. This is 5 mana for an artifact that says at the beginning of your end step, you may exile target creature you control, then return that card to the battlefield under your control. This is really impactful with any kind of ETB ability because it allows us to be able to reuse them. This is also a fun little way for us to kind of create a pseudo-vigilance-ish style of play with our creatures where we can target one of our creatures that is tapped down due to maybe having attacked one of our opponents, and then Conjurer's Closet will be able to target that creature, have it come back in, and it will come in untapped. Next up, we're going to talk about some of the enchantments that are going to help this deck out. The first of which here is Concordant Crossroads. This is a single green mana for an enchantment that says creatures have haste. This is for every creature in the entire game, so your opponent's creature is going to have haste as well, but that's okay. Their creatures are probably not going to be 12/12s with trample, so it's fine. You still want your creatures to have haste. Kenrith's Transformation is 1 and a green for an enchantment aura. It says enchant creature. When Kenrith's Transformation enters the battlefield, draw a card, and the enchanted creature loses all abilities and is a green elk creature with base power and toughness 3/3. We're kind of a little bit light in terms of general interaction. We are playing mono green, so Kenrith's Transformation, still a pretty good card here. We also have Song of the Dryads. Super happy that this recently received a reprint too to kind of drop its price by a little bit. This is 2 and a green for an enchantment aura. It says enchant permanent. The enchanted permanent is a colorless forest land. This card is wonderful. If we can enchant one of our opponent's commanders, Song of the Dryads is really difficult to get rid of because, well, you can't block with a forest, so takes their creature completely out of combat and really forces them to start using some of their spot removal on this just to get their commander back. The next 3 enchantments I need to talk about are all really good at drawing us cards. This first one here is Elemental Bond. It is 2 and 1 green for a total of 3 mana, and it says, whenever a creature with power 3 or greater enters the battlefield under your control, draw a card. Garok's Uprising is 2 and a green for an enchantment that says whenever it enters the battlefield, if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, draw a card. Creatures you control have trample, and whenever a creature with power 4 or greater enters the battlefield under your control, draw a card. And then lastly here we have Guardian Project, which is 3 and a green for an enchantment that says whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, if it doesn't have the same name as another creature you control or a creature card in your graveyard, draw a card. Guardian Project is a very powerful card, especially given that there are no duplicates in this format, so all of your creatures will trigger it. That's going to wrap it up for the majority of the deck. From here on, we're going to move over to the mana base. The mana base is going to include a couple of non-basic cards, and I'm going to start off with some of the utility lands. The first one here is Command Beacon. This is a land that you can tap for a colorless, or you can tap it, sacrifice it, and put your commander into your hand from the command zone. This is super important in decks that are going to be running a high mana value commander, and with ours coming in at 8 mana, it can be very easy for our commander to just kind of be taxed out of the game, given we do have a ton of ramp and a massive amount of card draw, so I don't actually think that's going to be too much of a concern, but still, Command Beacon allows us to get back into the fight in the case that our opponents keep killing off our commander. War Room is a land that you can tap to add a colorless, or you can pay 3 mana, tap it, and pay life equal to the number of colors in your commander's color identity to draw a card. This deck, it is pay 1 life, which is pretty small. I love card draw. I love card draw stapled onto lands, and War Room is just such a powerful card whenever it comes to mono-color decks. Up next, we have Rogue's Passage. This is a land that you can tap for a colorless, or you can pay 4, tap it, and target creature cannot be blocked this turn. It's kind of funny that we have so many massive creatures that if we want to give one of them unblockable, we have the ability to do so. Reliquary Tower is a land that says you have no maximum hand size, so you can tap for a colorless. This, once again, is going to be kind of along the same lines as Thought Vessel. Play this if you want to be able to keep all those cards in your hand if you are drawing tons, but do keep in mind this is going to prevent you from discarding for hand size, which means you could potentially mill yourself to death. Lastly here, we do have Homeward Path. This is a land that you can tap, and it says add a colorless to your mana pool. It also says you can tap it, and each player gains control of all creatures he or she owns. The last thing we want to potentially walk ourselves into is casting a really big and impactful creature to have our opponents steal it. So Homeward Path is a way for us to prevent that. The final non-basic land that I'm going to talk about for this list, at least, is Nykthos Shrine to Nyx. This is a legendary land that you can tap for 1 colorless, or you can pay 2 and tap it, and it says choose a color. Add to your mana pool an amount of mana of that color equal to your devotion to that color. This is a mono green deck, and we have plenty of green pips, which means our devotion should be very high throughout pretty much the entirety of the game. And if you remember from earlier on, one of the cards that I talked about, crop rotation, Nykthos Shrine to Nyx should be your target for crop rotation most of the time. And then to wrap up the mana base, seeing as how we are a monocolor deck and a lot of our cards go find forests anyways, we are going to be throwing in 30 basic forests, making the mana base of this deck relatively cheap. This is a deck that I do think is quite a bit of fun. I love these kind of like gigantic stompy, draw massive amounts of cards deck, and I think that this does exactly that. Now, I do try to keep all these deck techs around $300 to $350 just out of a personal preference. That's where I feel like most decks can really start to shine without actually including many of the like super powerful staples of the format. So currently, this deck comes in at $341. There are obviously some ways that you can adjust this deck in the case you want to build this for a little bit cheaper, or if you did happen to have a bigger budget. With that being said, though, do me a huge favor. Please make sure that you leave some comments down below. What were your favorite includes? How would you have built this deck differently? Or are there any other legendary creatures from the Lost Caverns of Ixalan you would like us to do deck techs on? Thank you so much again for all of your love and support. We couldn't do these videos without all of the feedback that you guys give to us. So once again, if you made it this far and you haven't subscribed, you know what to do. Until next time, this has been Guys at Magic. Peace.